So, Oliver, could you explain to me what NAFO is, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization?
NAFO or NAFO, there's some dispute on how you pronounce it, is a completely decentralized, leaderless movement that began to emerge on Twitter about a year ago when various pro-Ukrainian accounts started messing around and drawing pictures of Shiba Inu dogs and then kind of essentially giving them out to anybody who donated money to pro-Ukrainian causes.
And how old are the people that are taking part in this on average? Are they predominantly Gen Z?
No, in general, and as far as it's possible to tell, given that a lot of the people are operating under pseudonyms, it tends to be millennials or Gen X. Generally, people quite often from the UK or the US, but also very disproportionately from the Baltic states or Poland. So the parts of NATO and Europe that have been most supportive of Ukraine.
There's kind of been, since the beginning of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, there's been like a flooding of Russian bots. There's been a really big problem with them like flooding YouTube comments, Twitter comments, everything like that. And they're being used to dispel that, right? To kind of do a counter flooding of pro Ukrainian messaging.
If you talk to people who work in strategic communications for NATO or for any of the Western governments, what they'll tell you is that Russian propaganda is an absolute nightmare to deal with and has been not just during this war, but for years, because it's known as the fire hose. You're just dealing with this insane volume of guff that's being sort of showered out all over social media all day long. And you can issue rebuttals, you can issue very kind of factually well-grounded arguments for why everything is wrong. But you're always playing catch up because a lie can run around the world before the truth gets its boots on. What NAFO has, by virtue of being a kind of grassroots massive movement, is the sheer numbers to be able to drown out the propaganda at the source so that every time a Russian propagandist, like a Margarita Simonyan or a Maria Zakharova pops up on social media, they will instantly be inundated with sort of sarcasm and people pointing out the places where that they have been economical with the truth.
And you're completely right. The Kremlin's propaganda machine is incredibly powerful. Have have these tactics been have they been successful?
That's the central question, right? It depends on how you define success. The first criterion, I would say, is does Russian propaganda have free reign over the airwaves? And the answer to that is unequivocally no. It's now a fully contested information space where Russian voices have to really fight to make themselves heard and to kind of try and rise above this tide of just like memes and general nonsense. They've very much taken a heavy dose of their own medicine. The really big question, though, is to what extent the 95% of people in the middle are picking up on these messages from both sides. And there, I think you have to regard it as a numbers game. You have to look at the amount of traction that the original Russian comments are getting in the first place versus the amount of posts that are trying to take them down. And I haven't seen any kind of statistical analysis of it, but you're certainly looking at like reasonably comparable ratios. So I would say we're now kind of entering a period where the forces are much more evenly matched than they would have been 18 months ago.
NAFO, NAFO, they've had recognition from quite official bodies inside of Ukraine. Are they kind of linked to the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian government officially, or is it unofficially?
So it's a very big deal for them that they are not being kind of steered or directly promoted in any way by any state entity, and they've kind of made this a badge of pride because whenever anything on this like this happens on the internet, there's inevitably the allegation that it's some kind of psyops campaign being run from the CIA, and that has become one of the kind of central running jokes. NAFO does have some of its roots in the Georgian Foreign Legion fighting in Ukraine, of all places. One of the very early prominent users was a member of the Legion, And certainly NAFO has kind of promoted causes that are very dear to the Ukrainian state, but beyond a kind of alignment of interests and a really kind of passionate, emotional support of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian armed forces, it's not just like an extension of the Ukrainian state in any conventional sense of the word.
I mean, I remember during like the Black Lives Matter protests, for example, there were BTS K-pop fans, and they kind of did a similar thing during those protests. They started flooding police apps with just members of K-pop bands, and it's quite similar, especially tactics employed by hackers like Anonymous. Could we see this as kind of a more genuine and maybe even an official cyber warfare tactic in the future?
Well, what some of the NAFO fellas that I talked to during the research for the article pointed out is that any attempt to try and do this in a kind of obviously state-sponsored or state-directed way is probably going to fail because it just can't carry enough people with it. It's going to have that whiff of artificiality that means that it's very hard for any kind of government agency to harness directly. It has to come from the grassroots and the bottom up. And they were saying, if you're in government, just be grateful that you played a part in creating a civil society where this kind of movement can flourish, because that shows that you're fundamentally coming from the right place. But in terms of like the broader sense of the internet as a contested space for information, like, sure, absolutely, I think this is just the beginning, and there will be many more phenomena like NAFO. And in a sense, NAFO is, exactly as you pointed out, not entirely original.
And it's quite striking how, there was an article from Maxim Tucker in the Times, I think last week or the week before or something, about how there are volunteers who are infiltrating the Russian military. But also some of the people that are kind of doing things outside of the front line to help the war are slashing Russian tires or just booing Russians, or, doing any kind of sign of protest within Russian occupied territory. But then there's also people doing stuff like this, even from outside of Ukraine, doing things online. It's quite striking how for this war, it's a little bit like World War II, like how much people are able to help and how much people are helping even away from the front lines, how much of a nationwide effort this is in Ukraine, but also globally.
I think certainly for a lot of my pro-Ukrainian friends and a lot of the people that I have met through NAFO, there has been like a sense of, I don't know if powerlessness is exactly the right word, but certainly a sense of standing on the sidelines while somebody else does the work and does the suffering, and of wanting to support them in any way possible. And sure, people can donate money, but the value of NAFO, I think, for a lot of its members is that it's given people a sense of being able to make a meaningful contribution. And one could say, well, okay, you guys are just using some hashtags and posting a bunch of stupid memes, and that's true. But it's also, I think, I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which it helps the Ukrainians to know that there's this groundswell of Western public opinion on their side, and that there are people in the fight with them. And that's why you've seen the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, wearing NAFO T-shirts. That's why you've seen Zelensky thanking them personally. I really do think that there is a sense of connection between the people in the West who are doing this and the Ukrainians themselves.
And it is quite compelling that, compared to kind of other volunteer groups, I guess you've said some of them are in Poland, they're in Belarus, they're in the West, they're actually not even in Ukraine. This is just what they feel like they can do to support.
That's right. Yeah. And I happen to know like a handful of diplomats who are very quietly taking part in this. There's a lot of think tankers, there's a lot of former intelligence and military people. It's quite an influential network, and it's a way of kind of consolidating these groups of people who can provide other forms of material assistance to Ukraine beyond just kind of rhetorical support too.